Good evening. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. We're only going to look at verses 9 to 15. These are some of the people, Paul's people, some that are with him, some that have gone to other places, some that he has sent away to do other things, and others that he will be calling to himself. And I love this section. There are some personal things that Paul brings up. And I've always wondered, when my time comes, and I'm sure maybe you have too, when your time comes, how will you react? Sometimes we ask the question, if you knew you were going to die next week, how much would your life change between here and then? Or what you used to be and the way you would act now if you knew you only had 1 week to live? Remember when Paul was writing to the Philippians and he was incarcerated that first time, even though he thought he would not be put to death, he thought he would get out, but he was ready to die. And even in that situation, he was working hard for the Lord. And here he knows he's going to die, and yet still he's working hard for the Lord. And he wants to find ways to make sure others are also working hard for the Lord. So we have this farewell and this conclusion of the body of the letter here in verses 6 through 8, which we already looked at. And these remaining verses here are like a postscript, a little P.S. that he adds there at the very end. And chances are Paul wrote this part with his own hand, like he has with other letters. We might be tempted, when we're reading through the Bible, just kind of skim through this and go over it quickly. But there's quite a bit here. Closer examination, we can see Paul's emotion. We see his urgency here. And they reveal a lot about Paul as a human. He's flesh and blood, just like you and me, with a nature like ours. And so he's writing to Timothy, but he's also writing with the church at Ephesus in mind. And his letter has been preserved for over 2,000 years, and it has a message for you and me. So let's start by looking at verses 9 through 13, and let's see what Paul has to say. He writes, "Make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak, which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments." Most of Paul's letters are not personal letters. Rather, they're teaching epistles. Well, we use that term to describe them because they're not letters, they're epistles. But here in these final verses, it has all the earmarks of a private correspondence and with a wide range of thoughts, and they come in quick succession, one after another. And he starts off with this here in verse 9, make every effort to come to me. Loneliness is what I kind of see here. He feels probably a little bit alone. It's a desolate word, but Paul was personally acquainted with that feeling. He's had to deal with this before, and so he's not begging, but boy, it's almost like he's begging. Make every effort, and that phrase is translated from some words that are used at the beginning of chapter 2, verse 15. And I think the NIV puts it, do your best to get here or to be here. And so this urgent request is again repeated again in verse 21. Make every effort to come to me by winter. He really wants Timothy there. And as he nears the end of his life, he wants his beloved and faithful child in the Lord by his side. Come to me soon. And so he follows that up, and Paul gives one of the reasons why he wants Timothy to come. And most of those on whom he depended were no longer with him. And he speaks of Demas, who having loved this present world. Now, Who is Demas? He had been a trusted worker of Paul's. He was named 3 times all throughout the New Testament. He's mentioned in passing in Colossians 4. He's mentioned as a worker in Philemon, verse 24. And this third time is here, and he's portrayed as a deserter. A deserter. I was in the military. If you were ever called a deserter, man, that's the worst. That's the worst thing you could be called. There may be an intentional contrast here by Paul between verse 10 and 8, verse 8 where Paul said, who have loved his appearing, they would be rewarded. But instead of loving Christ appearing, Demas loved this present world. And maybe that's why he's a deserter. And we can't know the exact meaning of love this present world. Initially, we're inclined to think that Paul may be talking about the pleasures of this world, the passing pleasures of sin, Hebrews 11:25. But Satan has always made sure that there are passing pleasures that could entice us, to distract us, and pull us away from the work that we need to get done. And in light of Nero's persecution of Christians in Rome, it probably means that Demas was not willing to die for Paul. I think the last time I was up here speaking, I kind of painted that picture of Paul going into that courtroom, and he's all alone. And Demas wasn't willing to stand by his side in that time. And so he didn't want to take that risk. We're unsure why Demas would pick Thessalonica to be the place that he goes to. It's interesting that he didn't escape in the middle of the night. Paul knew where he went, so it seems like it's not like it was something unknown to Paul. So he must have made mention of this to him. Was Thessalonica his hometown? Did he have friends there? Maybe that's as far as he could get, the furthest from Rome. Some think that Demas did not cease to be faithful, but he just chose an easier field of service. He recognized how difficult it would be there in Rome, especially with Nero on the throne, and with what was happening to Paul. So maybe he was kind of like timid Timothy, that maybe I don't want to be too closely associated with Paul, and so I'm going to go preach over there, where it might be a little easier. It could be that. But it's always good, I think, to think the best of others. However, the impression left by that word, deserted. Deserted. It's a strong word, and it's made up of 2 prepositions in the Greek, forsake and abandon, or to leave one in the straits. It is the same word Paul used in verse 16 when he said, at my first defense, all deserted me. It is a despicable term, but that's what Demas was. And then Paul listed 2 other of his fellow workers who were not with him, but to whom he had no blames attached. He first talks about Crescens. He'd gone to Galatia. We don't know who this guy was. First we hear about him, but apparently he was a faithful worker for the Lord who was sent to Galatia by Paul. We know that area, so they definitely need good workers. Paul talks about Titus, and Titus is going off to Dalmatia. He's the worker that Paul would always send to the difficult situation. If you remember our study on Titus, we called him Tough Titus. He is the guy he would send to those tough situations like in Corinth and then the Crete and now to Dalmatia. He was a good worker. He was there for Paul's first imprisonment and apparently his second imprisonment. So Paul left Titus, like we said, on the island of Crete. Later, he sent a replacement so he could join him. After being imprisoned in Rome again, he evidently sent him to Dalmatia. He was now apparently sending him in that general area, probably to either, one, establish a new work, or maybe to build on a foundation that was already put there to help a struggling congregation. Whatever it may be, Titus is no longer there. But he was there. Just like the others who were good workers for him. So what I see Paul doing, not so much, even though he may be lonely, he wants Timothy there, but he's sending them away too. Here he is. He's at the end. He knows it. And instead of thinking, what am I going to do with these last days of my life? I'm going to make sure whatever it takes to keep the church moving in the right direction. I'm going to write letters. I'm going to find men. I want to send them to the right places to make sure everyone's going and working to the very end. No retirement. No saying, I can't deal with that, guys, right now. I got a lot of stress in my life. I got to present myself before the Roman emperor, and I'm going to die. Well, I can't deal with these other things. But he's not. He's taking as much on his plate as he possibly can and more. And he expects everyone else to do the same. He is a hard worker. And even though he's anticipating death, he still had a concern for all the churches. That's amazing. He could no longer go personally to enlarge and strengthen these places, so he's going to send other men to do it. He's going to make them do it. You come see me. Oh man, Paul wants to see me. What does that mean? Well, you know what that means. You're going to go preach somewhere. He's going to put you to work. No doubt, I think Titus was grateful, or Paul was grateful to have helpers who could go in his place. He was, I think, still lonely when he sent them away. And that's highlighted with that next phrase. Only Luke is with me, Timothy. I want you to come. Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke, book of Acts, had been one of Paul's most helpful servants, indispensable traveling companion. He had been with Paul during parts of his second and third missionary journeys, on his trip to Jerusalem, and then on to the trip to Rome for his first imprisonment there. Now he's also again by his side during these final days. It was dangerous to be closely associated with Paul at this time, but there's Luke. And John Stott said that it's a touching testimony to Luke's unflinching loyalty. And among the other services that he probably gave to Paul was probably his service of a physician. Of all the beatings that Paul had been through, he probably needed some help. So it's probably nice and good to have Luke around to help him out with the difficulties, maybe the lacerations, the pain that he had. So we should not think that Luke was the only faithful Christian left in Rome. Paul mentions several others when we get down to verse 21, but Luke was the one with him, there by his side, seeing to his needs, carrying out his orders. And maybe Paul also intended to convey the thought to Timothy that of all the co-workers whom he was familiar, only Luke was with him. So Paul desired for Timothy to join him and Luke. But he also wanted someone else. So he told Timothy, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. So evidently, Luke knew where Mark was and could contact him by on his way to Rome. Timothy. And Mark is a relative, as we know, of Barnabas. Remember, he's the one that abandoned Paul and Barnabas on the missionary journey. Later, Barnabas wanted to bring him along, and Paul said, no way, and they went their different directions. But as time went by, Mark matured, and during Paul's first imprisonment, Mark had been with him, Colossians chapter 4. And he said that now that he's useful to me for service. Being useful is being helpful or beneficial. We are not sure what the service was that Paul had in mind for Mark. Maybe it was another ministry work or spreading the word, but he probably had some idea what he wanted Mark to do in one way or the other. But one thing we do know, Paul, Luke, and Mark were together during Paul's first imprisonment in Rome. And now he has the desire for them all three to be together again on this next imprisonment. You know, between those three, they wrote 16 of the 27 books of the New Testament. You have Luke's 2, Mark wrote his gospel, and then of course Paul has all his epistles and this one. And so, here they are. They're going to come together again. Wouldn't you love to be in the room with Luke, Mark, and Paul? All three of them. Timothy, won't you come on up here with us? Okay. I would have no problem doing that at all. What a delightful time they must have had talking about Christ and His Word. That had been encouraging, I think, for Paul. Paul also identifies another individual here in verse 12 that he had sent out. He said, "But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus." Now that is another important member of Paul's missionary team. During his first imprisonment in Rome, Paul had entrusted this guy with all the letters to Ephesus, Colossae, and to Philemon. He took those letters down there. And he spoke of him as the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord. And now he's being sent to Ephesus, where Timothy's at. Chances are he is bringing this letter down there, and he's going to preach and teach there at Ephesus while Timothy comes up to Rome. So he's going to be Timothy's replacement. So another good, encouraging man for Paul. And Paul had other needs. He tells Timothy in verse 13, "When you come, bring the cloak, which I left at Troas, with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments." So if Timothy took one of the common routes up to Rome, he would pass by close to Troas. So he's going to stop by there. And a couple of personal items, right, that Paul wants to pick. What does that matter to you and me? His cloak and these scrolls, and especially the parchments. What does that mean for us? Anything? Nothing. But it tells us something about Paul. So, evidently, Paul had visited Troas during his travels after being released from his first imprisonment, and he had several items in care there of a friend that he called Carpus. And he's only mentioned here. We don't know anything about this guy, but he had planned to pick them up, but of course he was unable to. He got arrested and put back in jail. One of the items is a cloak. This was probably a large, sleeveless outer garment, circular in shape with a hole cut in where he could put his head through, and it would drape over him. Some things it was some sort of skin, but it would protect against stormy weather. Paul, was not wanting to be in discomfort. Unlike his first imprisonment, which he had his own rented quarters, now he's more than likely in a dungeon. It's probably dark. It's probably damp. It's probably cold. And so he wanted that cloak. And I always found that interesting. First off, Paul was not hurting for funds. Luke most certainly was not hurting for funds. Why couldn't Luke go out and just buy him something? But Paul didn't want that, apparently. He wanted this cloak. Well, I always found that interesting. I always wonder why. When I was reading up on this, I thought I had it in here. Walter Bauer's lexicon, there it is, cites the use of this in ancient literature, and he concludes that this must have been a leather. Well, I must have had that somewhere else. I apologize. We'll just move on. Sorry about that. But Paul, he gets this cloak, but he also asks for those books, the scrolls, and especially the parchments. And when we look here, Luke could have secured, there it is right there, a suitable overcoat for Paul in Rome. Why didn't he do that? And here it is. Edward McCartney describes it like this. It has been wet with the brine, his cloak has been wet with the brine of the Mediterranean, white with the snows of Galatia, yellow with the dust of the Ignatia Way, crimson with the blood of his own wounds for Christ. And now, at last, it serves its last purpose to keep an aged man warm during the cold winter. And I thought, man, that could be. Whenever I want to feel comfortable, I want to put on my favorite jacket. I have a black leather jacket that no one likes. They think it's ugly. They think it's old. But it's the most comfortable jacket I have. I love that jacket. I don't want to get rid of it. I remember the day I bought it. It was 1993 at the Metro Center. It's not there anymore. But that's where I got that jacket. It's my favorite. It's the warmest jacket I've got because I have a lot of memories with it. It has been with me through a lot of things. This is Paul's cloak. He's at the end of his life. He wants those memories, I think. And so he asked for that cloak. And Paul not only needed something for his body, but also he needed something for his mind. So he asked Timothy to bring the books, especially the parchments. The word books is in the plural, biblo, where we get the word Bible. Some translations have scrolls, which is more likely what they were. They were probably scrolls. But it was a common format of books at that time. The least expensive of these would have been made of papyrus. So he asked for those. It was a thick, paper-like material. So he wanted the papyrus rolls, but he especially wanted the parchments. Remember when Alex, I think you did a class on this, went through how all these different things were made. So you got the parchments. That's that skin. And that was a lot more durable, more expensive. It was prepared from the skin of a sheep or goat. And the skins were soaked in a lime for the purpose of removing hair. It was shaved. It was washed, dried, stretched, ground, smoothed. A lot of work. But it was a very durable thing to write on. Now, they could have been blank, and maybe he wanted to do some writing, or maybe these were actually things that were already written on. Maybe it's the same with those books, things that he probably wanted to read. I don't know. But he asked for these. I don't think it was pleasure reading, but I guess that could have been. Maybe there were things in there that Paul could use in his defense. Maybe he wanted to show that Christianity was not some new illegal religion, but a natural outgrowth of Judaism, and maybe that had something to do with that. We know Paul quoted from other people outside of the Bible or of New Testament scriptures or from the Old Testament, and he quoted from different philosophers. Maybe it was some of those things. Whatever their content, is interesting that Paul longed for these things. So he's inspired. He has been preaching for over 30 years. He's seen the Christ, right? He had a wider experience than anybody else. He had been caught up to the third heaven, and he saw the things there. And of all that he's been through, now he's in jail. He's going to die, and he wants his books, especially the parchments. J.W. McGarvey would always, before he'd go abroad, go to his library and finger all his books and say goodbye. He loved those books. Remember when Theo was here and he had all these books, so many books, and he and I would talk about our libraries, and I told him I was trying real hard to get all mine on Logos, the digital version. And he asked me, well, why don't you get rid of some of these books you have here? I said, I just can't do it. They're my books. And he said, yeah, I've got thousands, and I just can't get rid of them. Just can't do it. It's his books. And so Paul wanted to keep those. He was lonely, so he needed new friends. He was cold. He needed his cloak. His mind needed stimulation, so he needed the books. And even so, we have our emotional, our physical, and our mental needs. When we look at this, we need to make sure we don't deny ourselves of those needs, but we should always fulfill them in God-approved ways. And that's what Paul's doing. And what an amazing thing to read about and to think about everything that Paul's going through and the work he's trying to get done. He's not wasting a single moment. He's doing all he can for the Lord. And then verses 14 and 15. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. So he goes now from a personal request to a warning. He talks about this Alexander, common name of that day, primarily because of Alexander the Great. But we can't be sure about who this Alexander is. It's possible he is the same Alexander Paul handed over to Satan, we read about in 1 Timothy 1:20. It is unlikely it's the Alexander from Acts chapter 19 because of where he's at. You got to remember, Timothy is going to be heading to Rome, so he's probably going to run into this guy somewhere along that way. So we don't really know who he is. He's identified as a coppersmith, which just simply means he's a worker of metal. So Paul probably designated him that way so Timothy could know who it was he was talking about. And he says that this Alexander did me much harm. Did. That Greek word there, it's not a usual kind of Greek word. It's synonymous with show. It's the same Greek word used in 1 Timothy 1:16 as demonstrate. And over in Titus chapter 2, verse 10, it's translated as showing. Alexander had demonstrated, or he had shown, some kind of dislike for Paul by his actions. And the harm, translated from a plural for kakos, which means evil in the King James, the way that translates that word. So he had harmed or had done evil, Alexander had done to Paul. And then he says he vigorously opposed our teaching. Maybe that was all that Paul had on mind, but he uses the me there in verse 14. So it leaves the impression, right, that this is something personal. And he showed this great dislike of Paul. He brought harm to him. My supposition, and all it is a supposition, is that this is the guy that turned Paul into Rome. I wonder, is that why he points him out this way and in such a personal way? And that term "did" in the New American Standard, it's shown. So this is he did great harm. He showed how much he disliked and what he did. And you can't show that any better than having him thrown in jail and handing him over to the Romans. But whatever evil things Alexander had done, Paul said, the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Now think about that for a moment. If you have been working all your life for the Lord and done nothing but good, and if someone comes along and they hate you so much, they get you arrested, and even arrested to a group, hand you over to a group who's going to put you to death, just like Judas Iscariot did to the Christ. And you knew where this guy was. Would you want to do something to this guy? If Timothy knew, would he want to do something? Would you, if you knew that this guy did this to Paul and you were there, would you go and pay this guy a visit? Paul's leaving him alone. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. Paul wrote that. Galatians chapter 6. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Romans chapter 12. And even in prison, he keeps working for the Lord. But in verse 15, we learn here why Paul told Timothy about Alexander, because it was possible, perhaps even likely, that Timothy would cross paths with him. And Paul said, be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. So his location was somewhere along that route that Timothy was going to take. Be aware of this guy. Understand that what he did to me, he might do that to you. Avoid him. And Paul wants Timothy to stay focused on the work of the Lord. Stay focused. Keep working. Don't stop. And that can be hard and difficult when so much is happening to you and there's so many difficult things in your life. Remember Paul. Did Paul have a lot going on in his life? A lot of difficulty? And yet here he is writing letters, sending men out to preach, warning people about other bad agents, and making sure everyone's working and is going to work. And I also wonder about those books and those parchments. Maybe he was having those brought in so he could give those to Luke, so that Luke can continue his writing. Maybe there was some other thoughts that Paul had written down, and he wanted to give those to Luke so Luke could keep his writing going, to keep him working and doing work for the church and for the Lord. See, that's what we see happening. He's at the end of his life, and it doesn't stop. How many preachers do we know retired but never actually retired? I know quite a few. They keep working. They can't help it. Because when you know the truth, and you're walking down the road, and you see all these people, and they're lost. They don't know, but you do. It should trigger something on the inside of you. Cause you to want to open up, like Jeremiah can't contain it anymore. He's got to speak. And Paul could never stop, even in the very end. What a great example for you and for me. And that's the lesson I want to leave with you tonight, to take with you, to remember what Paul did here. We'll look at the last half, Lord willing, next week, if he gives that to us. What a blessing. Let us continue to think on that